What's up, guys? So, fair usage policies. If you have a SaaS business, you probably have a fair usage policy, a clause somewhere in your terms and conditions, and you probably should have. So, fair usage policies can be a lot of things and can be used for a lot of things. And I want to go through some of the, let's say, best practices that I've developed with my clients, and maybe they can be useful for you if you are about to put in a fair usage policy or you're confused about the one you have. Case in point, right now I'm working with a European scale-up. They do maybe 30 million euros ARR. They have 6,000 customers globally, and their customers is running, let's say, widgets through the platform. And we did a calculation and saw how many widgets they actually had in the platform. And we figured out that because of the fair usage policy that was in place, but also because there was no actual hard limiting factor on it, there was no sort of technical limitation. So whenever the customer actually hit the fair usage limit of running widgets, they could just keep using widgets or run widgets through the platform. And there was a legal term saying, well, we are entitled to charge you if you overuse above the fair usage, but there was nobody that had actually ever charged the customers. So we figured out that just in the last 12 months, we actually had the legal right to charge these customers an additional 28 million euros. So we could almost double ARR just from the fair usage policy. So we opted not to do that because we think that it might have triggered a major churn event and a lot of dissatisfaction in the customer base. We instead used it as, let's say, confidence and evidence that we actually had a pricing metric that we could use here, and we could upscale some pricing for some particular customer segments that were very heavy users. But I want to go over some of the ways that you can use fair usage, the way you can monetize it, and the way you can actually execute on it. So the first thing you want to do with fair usage policy is you want to figure out what the usage is and what it should be used for in your business. And generally, there are three kinds of things you want to limit or control with fair usage policies. And one thing is just a pricing metric that you've just put in as a threshold in your pricing. So let's say that you have something like, well, in the basic plan, you can have up to 10 templates, and in the advanced plan, you can have unlimited templates, whatever that is. In this case, templates is actually something you want your customers to have more of. But you're just saying, well, there is a limit to the small plan, and whenever you hit the limit, we want you to upgrade and pay us more money, right? So with something like this, you track whenever they try to create the 11th template, you say, hey, you can't, but you can pay me money, and then I'll release the additional usage that you can have on the platform, and then you can have as much as you want, or up to 20, depending on how you structure the threshold. So a threshold is just something that you put in place to then monetize whenever they hit that paywall, essentially is what a threshold. Another way to use fair usage policy is to say, well, we are going to have a pricing metric, but the thing that we're measuring in the pricing metric, let's say it's an API call, has a very big variance. So I had this with a customer once where they said, well, we actually want to measure API calls, but some API calls are way larger and bigger than some other API calls. So we found out that actually what we want to measure from a pricing metric perspective is actually API call seconds. Almost all API calls were way less than a second. So instead we said, well, we're going to measure API calls, but we're going to put in place a fair usage policy saying that any API call that is longer than a second, we're just going to count as another API call. And if it's more than 2 seconds, we're going to count as 3 and so forth. So essentially, we're going to say, hey, well, it is minimum 1 API call, but other than that, we're going to count 1 per second of API call that we have. So it's a way where you, instead of having a very complicated, dense pricing metric that is hard to explain upfront in your pricing, and you have to drag your salespeople and your customers through the process of explaining the seconds and cutoff points and so forth, you can bury this complexity in your terms and conditions, and you can still have it as a way to measure these and price these few outliers that you have that actually have this weird kind of usage where they send you some kind of unit that you want to price differently as compared to the majority of your customers that are just like regular API calls, whatever it is, right? So you can use fair usage policy in that way as a supplement to creating a more precise, appropriate pricing metric for some of your customers. So that's use number 2. The use number 3 is simply that customers using something and you actually don't necessarily want them to use that much of it. So it can be API calls to your system, and that there's a security risk once they use too much of it, whatever, but you don't think that it is necessarily tied to the value, so it's not something you want to use as a pricing metric. So you just want to say, hey, this is actually just like a proper use of the system should function within these parameters, right? So let's say you can create all the templates you want, but maybe you don't need a zillion templates, right? Maybe, up to 1,000 templates per user is considered fair uses. And above that, you're just like overusing the storage and the system in a way that it wasn't intended to be used. What you can do with these kinds is that you can put in place either soft or hard blocks. So let's say that your platform says, well, fair uses or reasonable uses is whatever, 100 units or something. Then a hard block would be that once they hit 100 units, then the system just stops. So like they cannot execute the 101st unit. This is of course good because you're never, your system is never overused. But if the unit is business critical to your customer, let's say that it's a whatever payment request or it's like some other things where if they can't process the 101st unit, it actually creates an operational problem for your customer. This can create a lot of friction in your relationship, especially if you sell to enterprises and you have a business critical solution. They will say, well, I need a guarantee that my solution will run, right? And okay, you have a fair usage policy, but there has to be some other way we can solve this instead of you shutting me down, because then I don't want to buy the solution, right? So then you have to put in place and say, well, okay, we are then going to create a soft limit, which is to say, well, the fair usage policy is 100. And once you hit 100, then there is an alert or notification that goes out, informs you that you have hit the fair usage policy and that you should take action. And maybe that same alert or notification goes to your customer success team and informs you that there's a customer in breach of the fair usage policy. You should reach out, you should try to resolve it, figure out if it's temporary, it could go back down, or if there is some sort of something else at play. If you have an actual, let's say, security issue or performance issue with your solution, let's say that fair usage policy is 100, but if they hit 10,000, then this one customer is loading the system so much that all customers break down regardless of what happens, then you should put in a hard limit somewhere after 100, right? So you say now you're working with two limits, soft and a hard. The soft being the fair usage policy, but they can go beyond that, but it now triggers, let's say, notifications to the right people. And then there's a hard limit way behind that at 500,000, whatever you think is appropriate, where you say, well, for security reasons, if you use it this much, we are going to shut it down, because we can't operate with this kind of usage. So this is usually accepted by customers. Sometimes you say, well, at this point, instead of shutting you down, we slow you down. So we're still going to process it, but it's going to be way slower, and you're going to take sort of a backseat, and all other traffic gets priority, whatever it is that the solution does. But you can work with these sort of tranched soft and hard policies. You can do it similarly with different thresholds for when you trigger added payments. So sometimes you want to monetize fair usage, saying, well, up to 100, that's what's included in the volume. Above 100, we have a right to charge you. But we're going to see as long as there's a soft limit, but if you just go to 105, then you go back down, not an issue. But if you actually go to, let's say, 150, we are actually going to charge you, because not only are you triggering like customer success actions and so forth, but actually also maybe there is an infrastructure cost and so forth. And we will actually sort of run this extra charge on you. You can also just have it straight at the fair usage policy. I think that whenever I see these sort of soft limitations in fair usage policies, usually what you'll see is that it is a very few, not always, but often it is a very few of the customers, like less than 5%, that has all of the unfair usage. And some of them have really peak uses. Like they are not only like slightly in breach of fair uses, they are like 10, 50, 200 times in breach of fair use. With customers like this, it is unreasonable to expect that they will actually pay 200 times the price of the core policy if you haven't had this commercial discussion with them, right? So you should reach out, essentially apologize for you not having the right fair usage operational system in place to sort of block them or slow them down or notify them and send them invoices and so forth. And then you should get that system in place and get them into maybe a better plan, or figure out another way for them to use it, configure the system differently so that they're not in breach, and then move forward from there.